Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura, and this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get people talking.
We've got a special episode today in which we talk to comedian, screenwriter, actor and author Rob Delaney about his book, A Heart That Works. As so often with books that pack a powerful emotional punch, this deals with a difficult subject as Rob tells the story of the death of his young son Henry and considers his own journey through the grieving process. It's also a deeply moving, funny, thought-provoking and altogether wonderful read. Fellow author Kathy Rensenbrink said it feels like a message in a bottle, a dispatch, a communication from the depths of suffering and despair that ultimately brings a message of great hope.
And so listen in as Rob and Kate share their stories, which, to forewarn you, do touch on the topics of death, stillbirth, and suicide, as well as joy and love and the importance of books as places of emotional refuge, sources of wisdom and pleasure.
All that coming up here on the Book Club Review. Rob Delaney, comedian, writer, actor, and also dad, which is how we connect. Regular listeners to the Book Club Review podcast might be slightly startled to hear someone so well known on this show. Our general specialty is the ordinary and the everyday, but that is how you and I connect, through the ordinary, everyday, deeply unglamorous world of parenting, which, of course, you captured so brilliantly in your show Catastrophe. Rob, welcome to the podcast.
Hello. You left out, however, when you were describing me, the title of Friend. We're real-life friends and neighbors. Just wanted to throw that in there and burnish my credentials a little further with that one.
Well, at the risk of immediately tarnishing that friendship, I have an early stage true confession to make.
Okay.
You might want to drop my microphone and walk out, but I have to confess, and it's only because I worry that, it might come up later and I might be sounding a little vague. And the reason is that Catastrophe, I have to say, it hit so near the knuckle for me.
Oh, wow.
And the everyday struggles that I was having as a parent, not to mention lack of time.
Yeah.
So on that basis, I've missed all kinds of cultural moments. I've never seen Mad Men. I've never watched Fleabag.
Oh, my gosh.
I've never seen an episode of Breaking Bad.
Oh,
so,
wow.
the list goes on. It's very embarrassing. I've only ever actually watched 1 or 2 episodes of Catastrophe.
Oh, that's okay.
But that was enough for me to know that it's a deeply funny, sharply observed look at the crazy world we enter when we become parents. But what listeners might not know is that while you were writing and starring in that show, your own son, Henry, was diagnosed with cancer at the age of 1, and 2 years later he died. Mm-hmm. And now you've written this beautiful book, A Heart That Works, that tells Henry's story and your own. I'd love to get you to read a little bit so people can get a sense of what it's like.
Okay. When you're a parent and your child gets hurt or sick, not only do you try to help them get better, but you're also animated by the general belief that you can help them get better. It might not be the wound cleaning you personally administer or the medicine you yourself pour into their mouth. You might have to get them to a nurse or a doctor who has the right equipment and skill set, but you believe that it's you who will get them to the right place by car or taxi or, God forbid, ambulance, and that once there, you'll sit by their side or maybe hold them in your lap and they'll get what they need. Add a little time to mend, heal, rest, and you'll soon have an exciting story to tell. That's not always the case, though. Sometimes the nurses and the doctors can't fix what's wrong. Sometimes children die. Whatever's wrong with your child gets worse, and they suffer, and then they die. After they die, their body begins to decompose, and later it's zipped into a black bag and taken away by an undertaker in a black van. A few days later, your child is buried in a hole in the ground, or cremated in a furnace that incinerates their body into ashes, which you will take back to your house and put on a shelf. You wish you could take a kitchen knife and stick it into yourself near one of your shoulders, and pull it down and across to the hip on the opposite side of your torso. Then you'd tear apart skin, fat, muscle, and viscera, and pull your child out of you again, and kiss them, and hold them, and try frantically to fix what you couldn't fix the first time. But that wouldn't work. So you sit there like a decaying, disused train station while freight train after freight train, overloaded with pain, roars through you. Maybe one will derail and explode, destroying the station and killing you, and you can go be with your child. Would that be so bad? Why do I feel compelled to talk about it, to write about it, to disseminate information designed to make people feel something like what I feel, what my wife feels, what my other sons feel. Done properly, it will hurt them. Why do I want to hurt people? And I do. Did my son's death turn me into a monster? It's certainly possible. It doesn't sanctify you. Things get broken. Maybe it's because I write and perform for a living that I can't help but try to share or communicate the biggest, most seismic event that has happened to me. Truth is, despite the death of my son, I still love people. And I genuinely believe, whether it's true or not, that if people felt a fraction of what my family felt and still feels, they would know what this life and this world are really about.
Yeah, that's a very powerful passage. I hesitated to get you to read that one because I know when I read it, I found it quite hard to go on from that point because it sort of so wrenched me by the heart from the very beginning. But I love that little paragraph about why you wanted to write this book, because I feel like that's something I think people might ask themselves is, why would I want to read this? Mm-hmm. You know, it's a lot to process and understand. And I have some experience of this because my husband and I also lost a child, our daughter Bronte, the week before she was due to be born. She died, and we never knew why. No one ever knew why. Everything was fine up till that point, and then suddenly we went for a routine scan the week before we were due to have her, and there was no heartbeat. And so, particularly for me, I really hesitated to read this book. I thought,
of course, I
don't know how this is going to make me feel. And I bumped into another mutual friend of ours, Emily, and she said, "Oh, I've been reading Rob's book." I said, "Oh, how is it?" Thinking she was going to tell me it was going to be really difficult. And she said, "Oh, Kate, it's wonderful. Sure, it's hard, but it is so full of joy and love. And you get this real sense at the end of a new perspective on the things that really matter in life." And I thought, okay, that I want to read. I'm in. So yeah, then I did get a copy and I took it home and I read it, and I read it in one go. I read it sitting on the bathroom floor because once I started, I just didn't want to move. And yeah, it's an extraordinary book. How do you feel having it out there in the world now?
It's a very mixed bag. And in the bag are some very beautiful things, you know, like you and I getting to talk about your daughter and my son. As bereaved parents, that's a beautiful thing, you know, that'll sustain us throughout today. We'll have spoken about them and, you know, they'll be alive inside of us for a little bit. There's warmth there and, of course, sadness, but that's part of the deal. I've heard from a lot of bereaved parents, bereaved siblings, and that's been really wonderful. So the book is getting to people that I hoped that it would get to, and that's amazing. And at the end of the day, at the end of the month or the year, it's really worth it. Also in the bag, there's difficult aspects to it because it costs me something to receive all these messages from people describing their pain and their loss. So I feel very raw now. The book has been out now, we're coming up on 3 weeks. And so as it was coming out, I was sort of fight or flight, book tour, press, going from studio to venue. And so there's an element of the show must go on, and I've got a job to do. You know, marketing a book about something so personal can feel inorganic and can feel painful. So as I was doing it, I was like, hey, I think I'm all right. But now a couple weeks later, I'm like, ooh, a bit deflated and a little depressed. And I think that's probably the most normal possible thing in the world that could be happening to me. If a friend were telling me that they had written a book like this and that a few weeks after its release, they were feeling empty or sad or isolated or whatever, I would say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But of course, since it's myself and my own feelings, I'm like, well, I must be broken or deficient because, you know, we always judge ourselves so harshly. So yeah, it's hard right now, but I figured I could be honest about that with you. And saying it out loud is helpful because I think it makes sense.
And when you've been through something like that, you do learn something about grief. You learn something about grieving and the process of grief. It's not something you'd ever really want anyone else to go through to learn those things.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have been in a position where you've ended up learning them the hard way,
Mm-hmm.
you know that there's something really valuable in there.
Yeah.
You've really gained something. And I think one of the things is a kind of understanding that when you gradually recover, I think, from grief is the way I think of it. It's a real process and you come out the other end. You're going to be like, normal is up and down.
Mm-hmm.
Normal is some days you're going to feel joyful and some days you're going to feel.
Thank you. For those who aren't watching the live feed, I'm pointing at Kate and nodding my head going, oh yeah, this is normal. Because I, like anybody, get in that thing where when I feel happy, I'm like, well, I guess I'll be happy forever.
Yeah.
Or when I'm sad, I'm like, well, this is it forever. Even at age 45, I'm still, of course, surprised and fascinated by my own quotidian, boring emotions that are very garden variety.
I was thinking as well about the perspective it gave me on my own family life. And I think perhaps that's something that this book really brought home to me again. And it was good to be reminded of that. And again, we've talked about this before. When you go through an experience like this, one of the really horrible things that happens is that you become very, very, very aware of the precariousness and the arbitrary nature of this life that we're given.
Yeah.
And you can't predict. You don't know what's going to happen. And when you're confronted with something like this, you're left with this unshakable knowledge, the conviction that everything can change in a moment and you can't take anything for granted. And although that's terrifying, it's terrifying. I think one of the things that happens when you're very raw and you're going through that grieving process is that that's all you think about. You're in that world where everything just seems so fragile because you feel like you see through everything. You see through all people's assumptions about life and certainties that everything's going to be fine when you know it's not.
Mm-hmm.
But it's that sense that you then appreciate those boring everyday moments of life, the little things, and even the wonderful things. It's a cliche, isn't it? But you do have such a sense of the preciousness of the time that you have with your loved ones, the moments that you have in this life.
Yeah.
And that's something, that's not nothing.
Oh, God, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I hesitate to apply this word to us, but it does afford you a type of wisdom that does serve you as you move forward and deal with the rest of life's vicissitudes. So you do gain something. I don't want to have it, but once you have it, you do. And it serves you. Yeah. We know things that other people don't in our bones.
I think the other thing I have found, and my daughter, it was a different experience because I never really met her. You know, she was a part of me. She was real. She existed, but she didn't.
Well, if I could say, I mean, you know, you conceived her and she gestated in the womb that your other daughters grew in, and you dreamed about her playing with your other girls, and they felt her kicking inside your tummy, and you and your husband looked at each other and thought, how wonderful. So I just, you know, allow me to please honor the magnitude and magnificence of her life and value, you know. So you don't have to. Yeah, I mean, because my child existed outside of the womb for some time. You knew her. Can I say her name? Have
Bronte,
you?
yeah.
Bronte, thank you. Yeah, you knew her. You loved her. She's with you. So just, I want that to be said.
Yeah, no, it's true. She was real and she existed, and I did get to hold her in my arms. But that was some years ago now, and I found life moves on and you heal and you're able to move on. And that's the way it should be. And sometimes I almost feel that wasn't real. It didn't happen. There's a part of me that feels like you just move on, and I think it's good and it's right that should be the case. And there's no physical evidence. There's nothing, you know, no way that you would know that she was ever here.
Yeah.
And I was troubled by that in a way. I have been a little bit uneasy about that. Like, should I be letting it go so completely?
Mm-hmm.
But what I realized, and I think what I really saw very clearly, and I was pleased to be reminded of it in A Heart That Works, is that what you have is the love.
Mm-hmm.
What you have is that pure sense of love that you felt. And that doesn't go away.
No, it doesn't.
And that's the thing that you're left with. And it's such a precious thing.
Yeah.
And you have that. And I felt this book that's what it meant to me. I saw that.
Yeah.
I felt like, wow, you've really made that visible. You've held that up so that anyone can see it and experience it. And that's an extraordinary thing to me, that you managed to put that into words.
Well, I think I did something that I didn't know was smart at the time, and or maybe lucky might be a better word, but when I started the book, I wanted it to be very angry, and I wanted to hurt people who hadn't held their dead child. So I really wanted to throw like a petrol bomb into the marketplace, and I wanted to offload some pain. I thought, well, maybe if I can really describe it to the best of my abilities and hurt other normies, then I'll feel better. And that's a selfish impulse and a negative impulse and a painful impulse. But the fact that I began the book with that energy, there was like a trick played on me, which is, as I started to write that stuff and burn away some of the anger or express it honestly, it really, like, organically, the love began to come out and shine through. So I kind of almost want to like go hug the slightly younger guy who started this book and be like, you know what? That angry screed of a book you want to write? Good for you. Go for it. It's perfectly okay that you feel that way. And guess what? You're going to learn something along the way. So the love that came through in the book was even a surprise to me, because that is seeming to be the big takeaway from people, is that there is so much love in the book, and that my wife's love for Henry and mine and his brothers at the book's best moments is like palpable to the reader. And so I think if the book is effective, it's because it was also effective on its author, me, in showing, not telling, the transformation of anger to love. Do you know what I mean? So the book happened to me as much or more as it did to any reader, because I wanted to write a book that was like, fuck you. I want you to smell my pain, you normal, smug asshole walking through life. Like me, the person I used to be, or the person walking down the street whose story I don't know. They might have had worse things happen to them than I have. But of course, I'm looking at people angrily thinking, no one can know this pain. So I think if the book has a secret, it's that it started as one thing and became another thing, even as the author didn't realize what was happening.
I love that happened. Yes, Emily, when she told me about it, she said it's a love letter. It's a love letter to your wife. It's a love letter to your family. Yeah. It's a love letter to all the people that you felt were there for you, that supported you. And yeah, it is funny. That's what comes through. I also, grief brain is real. And talking about it even makes, I think, our neural pathways go back to the time when it happened. And yeah, forgetfulness and your brain being like, don't go into that room, really is a real thing. There's a bit in here I loved about you just saying you forgot your bank card PIN number. Oh yeah, I had to call the bank. Yeah, I don't know. I'd like to think it's grief. I do. I suspect it's my wandering wits. Tell me about some of the literary references that were important to you, because another thing that people might not know about you is that you are also a reader. And in fact, when I first met you, that was the thing that I used to chat to you and your wife about, we were out and about and we would have these great conversations about books. So I knew you were both readers. Well, yeah, I love to read so very much. I was going to say I read them to sleep. They didn't go to sleep. But all three of my boys who aren't Henry slept in the same bed last night, and I read to them and left with them very awake and squabbling and having fun. But I often do read them to sleep, as does my wife. And then we'll read each other to sleep, and we'll read individually. So books, thank goodness, are a big part of our family, and they've brought me incredible joy and solace over the years. What's funny is, as I was talking about how I wanted the book to be angry, and it is, but then the aftertaste or the shockwaves of it are love.
I was thinking of The End of the Affair by Greene, which I mentioned in the book, and I feel like is probably the best sort of arc template for the book, like emotional template, because he begins the book, Maurice Bendrix, the narrator, by saying this is a diary of hate. And he's going to be talking about the loss of his love, Sarah. And then in the end, he says, God, I hate you so much. I hate you as though you existed. And so it's his path to faith. That was a big influence for me. I was destroyed by the film, The End of the Affair. Neil Jordan, maybe my favorite director of all time. Certainly my favorite adaptation of a book into film, because then I read the book, and it's amazing. I recommend that book to anybody who...
Yeah, I haven't read that one.
...who lives and loves and cares about anything and fancies themselves a misanthrope. I think it would be a good one to find out, maybe there's something good happening inside of me, you know? So that was very helpful. And then Frankenstein, I talk about a lot in the book. Can I read the first little quote in the beginning of the book from Frankenstein? Because I find Frankenstein so helpful with grief. Pardon this gush of sorrow. These ineffectual words are but a slight tribute to the unexampled worth of Henry, but they soothe my heart, overflowing with the anguish which his remembrance creates. I will proceed with my tale. Mary Shelley, Frankenstein. Yeah, that's what I wanted to open the book with for a couple crystal clear reasons. The most amazing one being that it's in memory of a Henry, and it's so accurate for what I wanted the book to be.
I had never read Frankenstein.
Okay, so I really highly recommend it. I don't think there's a book that's better. If there is, I haven't read it. I should say, of the books that I've read, which I've read as much as anybody, you know, but it's really nice. She was incredibly young when she wrote it. It's an epistolary novel, so it's all letters. The whole book of Frankenstein is letters written by an explorer who is searching for a northern passage through the ice at the North Pole. And these are letters from him to his sister back in London. And while he's up there, he meets Dr. Victor Frankenstein. And Frankenstein recounts the story of his life to this explorer, who then puts it in letters to his sister. So you're essentially the narrator's sister in this book. And it's written by the incredibly young, 20 or so. I mean, I think she might have started when she was 19. She was not older than 21 when it came out. And it's not long. And she is a genius. It's staggering to think that this book came out of one brain of a person this young. So that's nice to read something quite miraculous, regardless of what it's about. She's so smart and so probing in her intellect and can see so much more deeply than most.
Would it be a good discussion book? Would it be a good book club one?
Big time. Yeah, because the themes of it, should we try to reanimate the dead, for example? Grief, exploration, aspiration, because it's not all bad if you're trying to stop death. The impetus is you miss the people that you love and you want to help people. There's goodness in that impulse. It's fundamentally wrong. That's my opinion, but it's a strong one, that we should not try to stop death. That's not a great idea. That's like trying to stop the sun from rising or a wave from crashing on the beach. So attempting to be God, as we imagine God to be, I don't think is a good idea. And I think the people who do it pay a price, as does Victor Frankenstein, certainly. But there's so much to discuss in the book. But one thing in it is that Mary Shelley knew a lot about grief. She was a bereaved mother before and after writing Frankenstein. So she knew a lot about grief. She's got a big heart, a big brain. She explores these themes really beautifully and in a way that's very useful. So Frankenstein probably would be my number one grief map book, for helping navigate all that.
You also mention Joan Didion's book, The Year of Magical Thinking, which feels like it's almost become the classic grief memoir. I have a copy. I tried to read it. I love Joan Didion.
Yeah.
And I actually couldn't. I sort of got about a third of the way through and just felt like, I'm not ready for this yet. Now, probably I would be. I think then it just got put aside and sort of forgot about it.
Yeah.
And what was your experience of reading that?
with that book, for me, that is not strictly a grief book. Where that became useful to me, that book, because she was old, to say it one way, when she wrote the book, and her husband, who she's writing about, that died, was also old. And so once you've lost a child, when somebody in their mid-70s dies, that's sad, of course. If you love them, you want to be with them. And oftentimes these days people do live older than that. So it's perfectly natural and correct and everything else to grieve when your spouse of all this time. But that happens every day in every neighborhood of every city of every country in the world. So that's happening all the time. So I don't generally need to read a book about who's legally elderly, even though we don't always think of somebody that age as elderly. Legally, they are. That's not going to rock my ass, you know what I mean, having lost a child. But where that book really did become incredibly useful to me is that a second tragedy befalls her right away, which is her daughter begins to deal with a series of very serious illnesses, which when you read the book now, you know killed her. Her daughter died, Quintana. So that's when I was like, oh, wow. And the reason it affected me so strongly is because, as I talk about in the book, Henry died, but also my brother-in-law died a year before Henry did, while Henry was in the hospital getting chemo. Tobias died of suicide. He was my sister's husband, of course, and the father of their daughter, and my friend, and a wonderful guy that I loved. And he took his own life. And that was a nightmare for, in particular, my sister and her daughter. But I loved him too, and so did my mom, and so did my wife, and my kids miss him desperately. He's a wonderful, wonderful guy. He dealt with depression that was just vicious. Clinical depression reared its head. He sought help for it. He self-admitted to the hospital twice in the year leading up to his death. So he wasn't like keeping it secret or anything. He really was trying. And so that was so vicious and awful. And I was on the top of a bus coming back from the hospital with my older boys, who at the time were 3 and 5. And my sister called me and told me that her husband had died. And my wife was at the hospital with Henry, who was getting chemo. And that was stunning. Of course, it would have been on its own, but the fact that I have just left the hospital where my, at the time, 1-year-old son is receiving chemo for a brain tumor that will later kill him. We don't know definitely that it will yet because the cancer has not returned yet, but, we're prepared for that as a real possibility because it's a horrible type of brain tumor that frequently comes back and kills kids who have it. So that was just shocking, because my sister and I are the two kids. It's us. We don't have any other brothers or sisters. We're very close and have had a great relationship since the moment she was born. And I went into the hospital room with a little koala bear that I gave her. And just, we've been crazy about each other. I guess, we're 5 years apart. I'm a boy, she's a girl. And so we never competed for anything. We're just always pals. And so both our lives were just, somebody just came through with a scythe. So that was just staggeringly, unbelievably awful that two siblings are grieving particularly terrible deaths of people incredibly close and important to them who live under the same roof. And it just was crazy, the symmetry of these nightmares. Now, that is, of course, what I'm telling you is much more important than Joan Didion's book, but the reason the book became so useful to me is because she was dealing with twin nightmares at the same time. So that's when I was like, thank you so much, Joan Didion, for writing this book. Because, people talk about seeing themselves, like I'm a 45-year-old white American straight guy. So like I see myself represented all the time on TV and in books and movies and stuff. But in terms of two types of horrible grief at the same moment, I was very grateful to hear somebody else tell a story like that. So I felt there was something I could lean on, Of course, more than one terrible thing has happened to people all over the earth since time immemorial, but they haven't necessarily written about it with the skill of Joan Didion in the same time that I've been alive and had easy access to the book. So for me, when I heard, oh, a woman in her 70s, her husband in his 70s died, totally sad for her, my sincere condolences, but that's not remarkable. But something remarkable did happen to her, and I was very grateful that she had written that book.
I didn't know that about your brother-in-law, so this book had shocks for me as I was reading it. And so, yeah, grappling with this idea that you've got these two tragedies going on at the same time. And as I was reading it, you then tell quite a funny story about your mother and your sister in a cafe.
Yeah.
And they were approached by someone who knew you, a family friend, and he sort of says in a casual way, hey, to your sister, how you doing? And she tells him, doesn't she?
Yeah, yeah.
And he sort of looks a bit, not knowing what to say, as you do when someone tells you something terrible. And then he's like, well, how's Rob? Rob's doing well, isn't he? I hear he's doing really well.
Yeah.
And then your mother and your sister look at each other.
Yeah.
And your mother's like, shall I tell him?
Yeah.
It's like, well, Rob's son was diagnosed with brain cancer and he's had a horrible operation, and now Rob and his wife are having to deal with, and you talk about the guy just sort of stumbling away. But there's a sort of slight wickedness to that story, which is funny, but also very real. And I just thought it was interesting to me the way that you use humor to kind of punctuate this book. And to me, it felt like they were moments where, as a reader, you could take a breath. You allowed that change of tone that helped it feel balanced. I don't know. I just loved the way that was woven in there. And I'm guessing for you, that's maybe just your very natural way of seeing the world.
Well, I mean, I am a comedian, I think, still, ostensibly. And luckily, before I wrote this book, I'd written another book and plenty of pieces for newspapers and magazines and several series of a television program. And so I do now really fundamentally understand the value of giving people like a palate cleanser, because I think it's sort of weird. It's like sometimes the comedy can tenderize you a little bit and then let the next tragic thing hit deeper. And you want to gently and lovingly disorient the reader a little bit sometimes, because readers appreciate that. It's fun to not know what's going to come next. It's fun to go to a buffet and see the things that you would normally get, but then see something like, oh my God, like, wow, they have mango from Senegal? Why? I wouldn't have normally got that, but I'm going to get some Senegalese mango. And you're like, oh my God, this is so good. I thought I was just going to get a ham sandwich, you know what I mean? My usual buffet thing. But it's if you can break it up with stuff like that, I think any viewer, any reader loves that. God knows I do. My wife and I have recently become enamored of the films of an American guy named Jim Cummings. He does this beautifully. He's got 3 films out now. The first one is called Thunder Road, and it is way funnier than whatever funny comedy any listener is thinking about that they recently saw, and way more brutal in its sadness and incredibly human look at grief and despair, all in the same film. And as a result, it's the first film in years that I watched and then watched again the next day. I never do that. We've just been blown away by this guy and his skill at doing that. And it's audience proof. You couldn't, I promise, there's no one that could watch this and not be really moved by it and laugh a lot too. So yeah, that's how I like to do stuff, is spice it up, literally no matter what the subject is or the format, because I think it's a nice thing to do for the person who paid for your book or your movie with money that they earned at their job. You better give them a little flavor.
We've talked in the past about a short story writer you really love.
That would have been either Lucia Berlin, not Alice Munro. I mean, everybody loves Alice Munro.
Yeah, I feel like I'm less interested in Alice Munro because I feel like everybody
as a subject to talk about.
Yes, exactly.
You're less interested because you're more interested because she's the best, but less interested because plenty of people are talking about her.
But Lucia Berlin, I didn't know.
Yeah, Lucia Berlin is amazing. And what I love about her is, you know, it's hard to sit down and write. And a lot of people whose books we're reading, if it's not their first book, they might have written it in some measure of comfort. You know, they might have had the time to hem and haw and put it down, walk away, come back to it. But Lucia Berlin wrote all her short stories over the years while raising 4 different kids and moving all up and down the Americas, literally from Alaska down to practically Tierra del Fuego, because she grew up, her dad was a mining engineer. He just followed the minerals. So she grew up in crazy circumstances and then continued them in her own adult life, which included serious alcoholism. She would later get sober, raising 4 boys from different dads, and then becoming a teacher. And all that time, she just couldn't stop writing. So she wasn't somebody who was like, you know, I need my clean, well-lighted place to write my books. She got out the typewriter, you know, or the notebook in between feeding and changing kids and working as a nurse and all this stuff. So she couldn't stop herself. So not only are these stories blasting out of her, but she really became a master of the form. And she'll tell a story, my favorite kind of story, where you don't realize the structure and you don't realize the tricks that are being played on you, which aren't egregious. They're just breadcrumbs she knows she's dropping, but I don't. And then later twists it and twists your gut at the end. So just a gifted writer who's often telling stories that are lightly fictionalized from her own fascinating life. So she had amazing raw material that I'm sure would have been very difficult to live through. And the way she writes it and the circumstances under which she wrote it blows my mind. So she's like just this amazing flower that you found in the middle of the forest that had no choice but to share its beauty with the world.
And you have some amazing other writers who've blurbed the book. I was very excited to see Lauren Groff said, this book is so rich with grief and love and pain and humour and an incandescent, purifying, flame-throwing wrath. What an unbelievable gift.
I mean, that's ridiculous that Lauren Groff read my book. I've read all her books.
Yeah.
Crazy about her. And I'm so grateful she writes short stories too, because I love novels. Her latest Matrix was amazing. But Florida, her most recent collection of short stories, I can't get enough. So it makes me very excited because, you know, Alice Munro's not really writing anymore. Lucia Berlin is dead. Lauren Groff, I think she's like our age, maybe a little younger, and still writing. Yeah! So we got decades to go with Lauren Groff. If not, I'll be very upset.
I think that's partly why everyone was so upset when Hilary Mantel died, because we'd all just sort of blithely assumed that we were going to be getting all these books. And, you know, she was older, but still, I think that was the shock. It was like, oh, what? No more?
Oh, big time. Yeah, terrible. She shouldn't have done that.
Laura's book club are reading one of her early books at the moment, which is about living in Saudi Arabia with her husband and what life was like out there. And she says it's amazing.
Wow.
Yeah, so I think we're going to be doing that one for book club. But yeah, Patricia Lockwood, I could have read about Henry for 1,000 pages. I will turn to this book again and again to feel deeply and to learn about this world from Henry. I mean, she is another person who has a very immediate family connection with going through a child that's born with problems.
Yeah, I have the very good fortune, in addition to being a fan of her books, to know her a little bit. And so we communicated while Henry was still alive and while her niece was still alive, and we talked about stuff. And then, yeah, she wrote her gorgeous, incredible book, and then I wrote mine. So we chat about what it's like to have books this painful and visceral out there in the world. And so she's a very, very kind person, in addition to being an amazing writer.
What's something else that you've been reading, maybe more recently, that you've really loved?
Okay. I just read 3 back-to-back books about the Beatles.
Oh.
I saw Get Back, you know, the new extended look at the making of Let It Be.
I have watched some of that.
Okay. And there was one part where John and Paul are discussing George's departure from the band, temporary, and they don't know they're being recorded. And hearing the two of them speak sensitively about George Harrison's departure and their understanding as to why he was frustrated, and their sort of gently pushing and chiding each other about each other's personnel management shortcomings, like Paul pushing John, John pushing Paul, and then them looking at their own behavior as individuals and saying, yeah, I should have done this differently, could have done this. And it was just so interesting to see two geniuses in one métier communicate in another one. I hadn't previously read a lot of Paul McCartney interviews or John Lennon, I'm more interested in the music. But when I heard them analyzing relationships within the Beatles, I was like, just started thinking about how ridiculous it is that there was a band ever on Earth that had those two titanic talents in it, and their interplay fascinated me. So I just went down a big Beatles hole to try and learn as much as I could about the way that they made their music and the way that they interacted. So I read just, a broad survey of the Beatles. Then I read one that analyzes all of their songs ever recorded. And then perhaps the most interesting one was one by their sound engineer, Jeff Emmerich, who was just there all the time helping them craft the sounds that we know and love. If they were like, I want my guitar to sound like a train, he would be like, well, let me try this, and became very instrumental. So that was a fun hole that I fell down recently, was just trying to learn as much as I could about how the Beatles made their music.
I became completely obsessed by the Beatles earlier in the year when I read Craig Brown's book, 1, 2, 3, 4. Have you come across that one?
Don't even know what it is.
Oh my God, such a treat is in store if you haven't read it. He is a journalist and he specializes in these books that are, perhaps this is something he's come to more recently, but the first time I was aware of him doing it was with his book about Princess Margaret. And you wouldn't think a book about Princess Margaret would be remotely interesting. I certainly didn't. But the way it's written is what's so wonderful about it. And it's called 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret. And he brings in all these fragments. And they're from people who knew her or things that she did, news reports, or all this different kind of ephemera in a way that he brings together. And at the end, you get this incredible portrait of a person that certainly from the evidence that you're presented with in Craig Brown's book just seemed like an awful person. You would never have wanted to be around her in a million years. And then, to my enormous delight, he did the same thing with the Beatles. And so 1, 2, 3, 4, it's called The Beatles, A Portrait in Time, I think. And it's one of those books which is so wonderful because not only is it about this subject, the Beatles, and a lot is known about them already. So one of the interesting things is you feel like, well, how much can you really tell me about the Beatles? Everyone knows about the Beatles. When you finish Craig Brown's book, maybe you're at that level already, so it'd be interesting to see what you made of it. But, you really, really, really know about the Beatles. Like, you've lived and breathed their world, but in such an interesting way, because what he taps into is what you were just talking about, actually, which is John and Paul talking and they weren't aware that they were being recorded. And the brilliance of the way that he goes about accessing the subject, it's the same. It's portraits of them where they're not aware. So you get this insight, this real insight into what they were really like. And because it's so indirect, this source material, I think that's what makes it really work. One of the things I found so fascinating was the creative dynamic between them and all the people in their orbit, which just comes across so beautifully in the relationships and the interpersonal dynamics. It's absolutely
I can't wait.
riveting. And then as a result, then I was really interested to watch the movies. Because once you've read that book, then every moment in those films is completely electric because you know all the backstories, you know all the things that are going on. It's so good. He's such a great writer. I love that you haven't read that. I'm going to see if I've got a copy. I can give it to you. Rob, I feel like I've taken up so much of your time. Thank you so much for coming to talk to me about your book. It was such a amazing
this is very
experience.
special to me because for all the press that I've done for this book, they've been nice people that I've spoken to, but you're somebody that I know in real life and have a friendship with and have a common bond that is, indescribably powerful and that links us. So this has been very nice for me.
Oh, well, thank you. And yeah, perhaps you might come back another time
I will.
just to talk about a book club book.
I will.
That's nearly it for this episode.
In the book, Rob mentions 2 charities, the Rainbow Trust and Noah's Ark Hospice, both of which provide emotional and practical support to families who have a child with a life-threatening or terminal illness. Links are in the show notes if you'd like to find out more and support them.
You'll also find details of all the books mentioned in the show notes and on our website, thebookclubreview.co.uk. That's also the place to find the episode transcript and comments forum, where you can let us know any thoughts you have on the subject or share book recommendations. We especially love to get those. You'll also find our archive of over 100 other episodes to listen to there, from our recent Booker Prize special to sparky book club debates.
To keep up with Rob, you can find him on Twitter and Instagram at Rob Delaney.
If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram at Book Club Review Podcast or on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod. You can also always drop us a line at thebookclubreview@gmail.com.
And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts and never miss an episode. If you like what we do, please do take a moment to rate and review the show, which helps people find us. Better yet, tell your friends and let people know about us on social media. We love to reach new ears.
That's it for now. Thanks for listening and happy reading.